It's nice to be back here. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives, and it's Friday night, and that means we're having a wonderful guest once again from the Schiller Institute, Mr. David Shavin or David Shavin. He says you can say it either way you like. and
As I
so
say, just don't call me late for supper.
All right, but I'm going to call you David because this is our fourth time getting together, and it's been just a great pleasure to explore the subject of the classic composers and their relationship to the American Revolution, Mozart, Lafayette, the connections between the Viennese, the Parisians, and people like Benjamin Franklin on this side. Of course, the connections are sometimes obscure, but you've been able to draw them out in your writing, and the essays are available at Executive Intelligence Review. If anybody wants to get in depth, they're quite interesting. But let's get back into our just general discussion of the subject of the impact of the American Revolution upon the great classical composers of Europe. So let's just start right there where we left off, David, and turn it over to you.
Um, I just think Americans, are jaded about when they actually contemplate what our country was about. People just assume we're technologically equipped, we have the best military, we can beat up people, we can bomb them at least. Um, we have our will on imposing the dollar around the world. But for most of our history, that was not us. That was the British Empire. That's an imperial form. And it should not be a big surprise that the founding fathers, the idea of having a republic and basing the chances of that republic on having each generation come out a bit more skilled and educated and capable than their previous generation, than their fathers and mothers, that was a big fat idea, an interesting idea to anybody, not just composers in Europe at the time. The Americans are jaded. They're not appreciating the uniqueness of the country. They just accept it. It comes as a surprise that thinking people in Europe would not have been profoundly moved by what was happening here, by possibilities of a change from hundreds of years of feudalism and colonialism. So it's looking for the details. Most of the articles I've done, you mentioned Paris and Vienna, Berlin, and I would add to that. Every time I look into detail into countries and their history of that period that I did not know much about beforehand, I find out that there's remarkable connections in terms of the faction fights, in particular in 1781, 1782, 1783, that particular period where everything was possible, where the British Empire had been defeated. The world had been turned upside down on them. And that was before the French Revolution, before things got jaded, that it's the only way you can oppose a feudal system is you get into a rage fit and you start chopping off the heads of people you don't like and think everything's going to work out okay. That there was a window of opportunity before that where you can look into the capitals of Europe and find, even among monarchs, a consideration that maybe they should run things a bit differently. Maybe they'd have a better kingdom if they freed the serfs and started educating their population and bringing them really what we call into a middle class.
And into that walks the great composer Mozart. You took us through his approach to that in the abduction of the Seraglio. Remind us what he was doing when he did that revolutionary act of creating what really is a kind of a combination of what we call opera now and folk song in a way, a traditional form that is, we call it opera now, but like the Pasha at the end, he doesn't even actually sing. He comes in and he speaks. But this all was a method of communicating not to the rulers, but to the common people of Austria at the time, and that I think bespeaks of of a relationship right there with the drive of America, of the common people of the United States to be free. Um,
Right.
you want to fill that out a little bit, because that was the theme of our first meeting 3 weeks ago.
Sure. I mean, but when I do this, people should think in English language, in the English culture. You had Shakespeare. People read Shakespeare, and it's hard to believe the general population went to the theaters and they followed complex thoughts with a lot of humor, some of it bawdy. Handel's Messiah, setting part of the King James Bible to some of the text, to tell that narrative, tell that story, that for a couple hundred years singing Handel's Messiah in English, enriched and ennobled the population. What happened in 1781-82 with Mozart and John, what you're describing with the project of a German language theater pushed by Joseph II, I think we covered a little bit of this, the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire met with Gottfried Lessing, Lessing, a very unique German dramatist, on the project of elevating the German theater above the level of basically soap operas. It's like trying to talk to, it's like a studio head who just likes to sell soap, as the soap operas are called, just to do whatever it takes to get the housewives to tune in. All of a sudden he decides, I've been treating people badly. I think they have more to them than just tugging at their heartstrings every week about some soap opera. And let's actually establish a theater to put your average population into the middle of history. Let them think that they can make history, even though everybody's not going to make history. Let's pose to them questions. And Lessing's dramas from the 1760s and 1770s, this is what captured Joseph II's interest. And they met, I think it was around 1776, 1777, around that period. I'm sure it was around that period. I don't remember which year. They met on this idea of forming a national theater. And Lessing, I think I refer to his ironic comment afterwards. We have an emperor who wants to have a national theater for Germans, where we don't really even have a German nation yet. But Lessing very well knew that the way you actually build a united nation, a sovereign nation, is you enrich the language the way Shakespeare did, the way Dante did for Italian. John Milton helped this project in English. You enrich the language. You deliberately enrich the language. You pose concepts to people that, I'm told in Dante's time in the 1300s, Italy, in feudal Italy, general population knew about 500 words. That's pretty much all they needed to function in the little valley they were in, and they never traveled outside that valley. They walked behind a cow's rear end a large part of the day. And Dante's project, deliberately enriched the culture by posing concepts about immortality. Doing it, so the different cultures went through this process. And this is what Mozart got wrapped up to when he walked into Vienna in 1781. And it happened to be a time that the world was getting turned upside down on the British Empire. I can go into refresh some of the more details on that, but let me say a couple things about that without trying to go into the length that we had on the other three operas, the Beethoven Fidelio, the Mozart Magic Flute, and the Abduction from the Seraglio by Mozart. Mozart wrote a couple other major operas for the emperor in the 1780s. They were in Italian. They were directed towards court fights. I'll just reference them. The one is The Marriage of Figaro, because Joseph II was having a lot of trouble with backsliding among the his fellow princes and counts and whatnot. He had forced them to free the slaves. They could not run their estates based on slavery anymore in 1781, but he can't force them to use the newfound freedom of the serfs to invest more in them by educating them and expecting more skill levels out of them, more education, more literacy. So he had a bunch of backsliding nobility who wanted to go back to the good old days, and they put a story by Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais, the man who, yes, he was a playwright, but he was the man who got weapons to the United States illegally, got French weapons to the United States in 1776, 1777, 1778, before the French became our allies, at a point that the British court was yelling at the French, "We think you're surreptitiously getting weapons to those American rebels." And the French court was, Beaumarchais was working off the reservation, and he wrote a play, The Marriage of Figaro, to ridicule the parts of the French court who simply wanted to use the Americans to bring the British down a peg or two, but they really weren't in favor of what the American project was. So you have this count who's, on paper, he's given up the right of the first night, the right to sleep with any woman on their first marriage night before her legal husband gets to sleep with her, and to deflower her. And this noble liberal count has given up that right. He's a good guy on paper, but he spends the whole opera, and it's a long opera, trying to reassert that right de facto. He's given it up he's not going to force this situation, but he hasn't changed himself. He's still driven by his chemistry and his lust for these women. And so they play a sex farce on him through many hours. And you wonder whether this guy's ever going to learn any better ways of functioning. And this was played in France in the 1778, 1777, Marie Antoinette actually pushed this play as a play in 1782, 1783, as her husband, Louis XVI, is trying to consolidate all the efforts they made in the American Revolution. Basically, France bankrupted themselves by fighting with the Americans, and it wasn't going to work out for them unless they also had their own semi-revolution in France in 1782, 1783, where they got the benefits of working with the American colonies. And Marie Antoinette, without going into the details, she promoted Beaumarchais' play. She acted in it herself. It was played among all the different nobilities in the courts, even though it was a very controversial play. Mozart took this up in 1785, I believe, knowing all the controversy. This fellow I mentioned last week, Count Anton Peregrin, banned the play. And Mozart still went to the emperor and said, "Let's do this play." And the agreement was, we'll do it in Italian. It'll be directed toward my nobility. And that was fine with Mozart. That was where the problem lay. That's where Joseph needed the help. So it was a very directed play. I'm giving it short shrift, but I'm going to not say anything more about that. It was a very successful opera. However, it was pretty late in the game. It was 1786 by the time it was performed. The backward sliding nobility was getting the upper hand. Joseph II was less and less in control of his empire, and certainly less in control of his reforms. And Mozart and his playwright Da Ponte, Emmanuel Da Ponte, who had collaborated on The Marriage of Figaro, they decided to up the ante, and they wrote a play that could have gotten them both jailed. Mozart was going to head out of town, move to London. It's a whole nother story in 1786, but they decided to give it a go, and they put a very edgy opera on stage to really confront the emperor with how he was being played up with a sex scandal. I won't say more about that. I'll just make that allegation. You can go read about it. It's if you punch in my name along with Casanova and Cagliostro, Cagliostro, a real bad type of Freemason and a real type of the type of he was the guy who ran an operation at the same time in 1786 in Paris against Marie Antoinette called the Necklace Affair to try to organize the rage of the population against the king and the queen. The king and the queen had problems, but they weren't the problem. The people manipulating, speculating on the French financial problems and making it worse by cornering the market on wheat and making it very difficult for the French population in the cities to get their daily bread. This is what drove France crazy, and Louis XVI never figured out the financial manipulation going on at the time. But this is the Mozart I'm saying by the stories is from 1781-82 to his death in 1791. Had at least 4 major operas in league with the French court, or at least 3 of them. The Don Giovanni might have been his own invasion of the French court. It was, and there's Clemenza de Tito also for Joseph's brother, the emperor who succeeded him, Leopold, for his coronation in Prague. All these operas, there's not an opera that Mozart did that really wasn't vectored in a strategic way, was very edgy at the time, was known to be, and was key to the fight over those 10 years.
May I
Sure.
ask you to go back to the Marriage of Figaro for a minute, because with all of this revolution going on, and we haven't spoken about Figaro himself, the great factotum of where is it? Seville? Is that where it is?
I believe you're right. I forget these things.
But he's the fixer. He's the guy that takes care of everything, and also he happens to be a barber. And the idea of putting a barber in a position like that, when a lot of people were going to get a very close shave in a few years, might have some resonance for people too. But who, in your opinion, what does the character Figaro come from Lessing, or is this another case of Mozart imposing his own characters onto people so that he can make a statement, and more broadly by making Figaro into a hero, which he is, and he's a comic hero, but he's an everyman hero. Is he not promoting once again the spirit of the American Revolution, and how was that? How does that play in the courts of France at the time?
Well, John, I hate to say it, but I 110% agree with you.
Well,
it wasn't Lessing so much.
I just didn't want to get past without without talking about the guy with one of the most famous arias of all time. I mean, even Bugs Bunny.
Figaro. That was actually Rossini's version of Figaro, who handled the same character.
Yeah, right. Okay, sorry. But anyway,
but you're dead on target. Figaro is the figure that everybody identified with, both in the play and also in the opera, in the sung version that Mozart did. And yes, it struck everybody that everybody noticed that he's he's more than Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais was not a nobility. He was a self-made man. Figaro is a self-made man. The Americans are self-made men. Figaro runs circles around the Count during the course of this whole opera, and actually Susanna too, his wife, Figaro's wife, that the Count is lusting after. Figaro knows this. He knows the problems with the Count, knows the hypocrisy of the upper nobility, knows how to manage the situation. The question whether he's going to become a revolutionary and overthrow the situation is he has the talent to do that. And Beaumarchais certainly is that type of figure. And a lot of Figaro's character comes from the historical Beaumarchais. And yes, the audiences both in Paris and Vienna very much picked up on the fact they're looking at the guy who's got more smarts, a lot more smarts than the supposed upper class nobility who are all educated and should know better. They're looking at Figaro just dance circles around him, and that's part of the comedy of the whole thing, for sure. Actually, I wanted to address, if it's okay with you, we can go more into this, but the question you had at the first show, which I'm not sure I really, why is Beethoven in classical music so central to Lyndon LaRouche and his movement?
Yeah.
I think we've covered that by covering my argument that the culture played a causal role at a very important time in history. But just to dig into this a little bit, and it leads into this show I want to advertise for tomorrow, this colloquium people can tune into. It's on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of August 15th, 1971, the day that Nixon decoupled the dollar from gold and pretty much ended, it's hard to say all black and white, but if you had to pick a day when the national sovereignty ended, it was August 15th, 1971, because once you take national currencies and say, we're not going to defend our own national currency as it's pegged to other currencies around the world, we're going to leave it up to the private sector, the market, the Wall Street and London speculators to start playing with national currencies. It's not a good day. And LaRouche made a forecast. It was his third forecast of 9 famous ones. And this third one, people were shocked by, was that the unaddressed, Lyndon Johnson's attempt to both have a poverty program and a Vietnam War, to have social programs, spending, and it wasn't going to work out. It was an imperial war. It wasted an awful lot. And the Apollo program that Kennedy had set up could have flowered into all sorts of skilled jobs for the United States, where, as you put at the beginning of the show, the rest of the world would have loved us. The rest of the world did love us at a time after World War II when we were exporting the TVA program to different countries around the world, countries who wanted to escape French or Dutch or German or British colonialism. They looked to the United States. Where I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, you had people coming from around the world in the 50s and 60s to look at the miracle of how a government-sponsored infrastructure program worked and how it paid back, how every dollar the government invested paid back 10 to 15 times over. Oh, it took 10 to 20 years, but it paid back once you once you ran these projects. That type of thing LaRouche forecast was the way to solve problems in the 60s, and it's what we ran away from. And he said, this will shatter. And sure enough, it shattered. And people want to know, how did LaRouche know that? And the short answer is because he understood the mind of Beethoven. That what's needed for an economy, in a word, is qualitatively new scientific discoveries from creative minds. And LaRouche never believed that those things were simply happenstance, lucky accidents. You can't put it on a computer program. You can't manufacture genius in that way. But the type of paradoxes that you can present to people, the type of new discoveries, if they're really new discoveries, like figuring out how the sun is a fusion plasma device and how we can machine tool that here on Earth with the plasma physics, not just the massive energy, clean energy from a fusion device, but all the industrial processes, the way you have a fourth state of matter, plasma, a very not blood plasma, but like the type of gases where on the sun's surface, where it's so hot, the electrons have separated from the protons from the core, and you have these plasma flows of massive energy dense charged flows, like these electrons. They exist as their own entity away from the neutron, the core of the atom. This is a different world. It was hard to talk about, but you pose what happens, and LaRouche was convinced that that was the future that economies had to tie themselves to. But the mathematics to describe, well, I mean, instead of talking about fusion and plasmas, there was a paper by Bernhard Riemann, and LaRouche's method is called the LaRouche-Riemann method. And the historical figure, Bernhard Riemann, was a physicist and mathematician back in the 1850s and 60s in Göttingen in Germany. And he wrote one paper, he wrote several papers, but one forecasting that there would be something called a sonic boom, hypersonic boom. And it was ridiculed. This was 1859, before we ever had any hypersonic booms. And that if you had something moving through our atmosphere at a speed greater than the speed of sound, the invisible atmosphere, which is really gases, would act in such a way that if you analyze the tensions and pressures as the directed energy went through the atmosphere and it approached the speed of sound, you'd have to figure out a different causality that happened on the other side of the speed of sound where you had that sonic boom. There'd be different quality of interactions of energy and matter. And this was forecast. And in Beethoven's music, you'd have to challenge the human mind to figure out what happens on the other side of anything they expect. I'll give one example. Beethoven's famous Fifth Symphony, bum, 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 bum. You know, somehow that's a melody. You have three short things and one long thing.
What's a motif?
You know, with almost no melody to it at all. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. So there's a little melody. Well, how does that connect with the second melody? Do you happen to know the second melody offhand, John, in the Fifth Symphony?
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's about 60, 70 measures in. You know, and all, classical music had a second theme.
If you hum it, maybe I can come up with it.
I'm going to do it in a second, yeah. And the horns, maybe I'll give you another cue. The horns come in, interrupt things, and go, ba 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 bum, bum, bum.
Yeah.
What's next?
Da, 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 da.
Yes, exactly. But most orchestras don't play it correctly. They go something like, which is the natural thing to do. You have 8 notes, you break it up 4 and 4. It's very even-handed. But what Beethoven wrote is something. He wrote something a little awkward. 6 notes and 2 notes. He phrased it with a slur mark. And the puzzle is, how does that connect with ba 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 ba? Either most people just say, well, he was interested in some other melody. He went on to a different part of the story. But you have actually in the mind shapes of how the human mind thinks. I know people want to think their mind is free to think any way it wants to, but it really is not. There's all sorts of history to why the mind does what it does. There's a freedom element to it for sure. But Beethoven thought you have 3 short events and 1 long event. Bum, 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 bum. It has 2 different qualities to it minimally. It has a 3-to-1 relationship, 3 of one thing, 1 to another. So there's a certain metrical proportional thing going on there. But there's also simply something that precedes anything metrical. It just short, 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 long, like it shows up in poetry and all sorts of things. Just it's prosodic. It's not even before you attach 3-to-1 to it. And what he does with this second element, he proves that. He says, which is, it's 6-to-2. But now, or 3-to-1, 3 measures to 1 measure, if you wish, if you reduce the 6-to-2 relationship down to 3-to-1. But it's more importantly, it's now the 3-to-1 has been removed detached from the 3 shorts to the 1 long. And now the long element is attached with the 3. And the short element is attached with the one. Dee-da-da-da-da-da is the long element. Dee-da is the short element.
Yeah.
Now, Beethoven had to say all these things, but Riemann had a whole essay about topological relations, relations of shape, of relations of shape, before you ever get to what kind of metrical relations are appropriate to that particular space. And I'm getting a little technical, but they're not the same thing. The mind can think in shapes. Sometimes this is called in Gestalt psychology, gestalts, patterns, shapes that almost precede being able to form words, events that happen in your mind, which are causal, which have shapes, but they're ideas before words are attached to them. Yeah. And Bernhard Riemann was very big on describing how he did mathematics this way, in terms of how we call them thought masses, Geistesmassen, or spirit masses. And Beethoven, I'm saying, in his Fifth Symphony, is showing causally, in a rigorous fashion, how ideas form and shape and get transformed before any words ever get attached to them. And he's basically going inside people's brains and saying, I can sell you on the development of these ideas because I know how the human mind works, and I'm willing to introduce you to what's universal about how your mind works. And people may not know all these. I've attached a lot of words and explanation of these things, but LaRouche
let me jump in, David, because I don't want to lose what I think I've got here, and I'm going to see if I've got this, if I'm making sense out of this. So you have this basic motif, da 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 da, and now you're comparing that to the theme of the second movement, da 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 da.
Yeah, it's the second theme of the first movement. Yeah.
All right, second theme of the first movement. Thank you. So it's like doubling the beat. So, or what you might in jazz you might say splitting the beat, but it also reminds me of what Mozart does is in an appoggiatura or a prepared tone, just like a bass player would do in a jazz band, would say instead of going dum 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 dum, might go dun 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 dun.
Exactly. You know, they call it condensation, and when you stretch it out, it's called augmentation. But yeah, that's
but keeping the idea that this is something you can see with musical analysis, right? Saying, okay, here's the basic idea, and here is a development of that basic idea, which I would never have seen ever. I mean, you point that out, and I say, okay, yeah, I can hear now that it's that the 3 beats are now 6 beats, and the 1 beat is now 2 beats. In achieving that knowledge, that's what you call thinking like Beethoven, or at least recognizing that the brain organically is going to change things without you having to put it through a logical sequence of, actually uttering the words of, we're going to alter this note by raising it a half step and this one by lowering it a half step. It's just going to happen. And like we were talking about Shelley the other night with poetry, it just kind of happens. But how does that get us into successful political outcomes? As you say, think like Beethoven in order to solve the problem, as LaRouche would do.
Good. I mean, LaRouche was trying to be rigorous, that it's not, look, everybody says, I have an idea, it's on the tip of my tongue. I'm a good person, and it's a struggle to try to formulate the words that have that idea take shape and form and be able to be socialized. LaRouche was saying, beyond just saying, oh, we should invest 5% of the capital of the country in basic research and development. Why 5%, not 1%? Why not 20%? What can the country afford to do in terms of should it be a 15-year plan or 30-year plan? How do you measure that? Something that Ben Franklin used to say, what's the value of a newborn baby? LaRouche tried to say, hold it. uh, we've got to figure out before the sonic boom, the type of things that happen before the sonic boom, the type of interaction. I mean, most physics, they say it's just hardball particles. They bounce against each other. We can do all the mathematical formulas based upon Isaac Newton, and it's going to describe how these hardballs act towards each other because of some magical force called gravity. And it gets more complicated, but we can predict you how heat's going to spread out in a room, how everything's entropic. Oh my goodness, this shock wave happened. I don't know how the heck that happened. Where'd that sonic boom come from? There's some invisible thing out there called air. Okay, and they try to accommodate themselves to it. But LaRouche tried to do in economics to ask the question, we don't know what the precisely what the worth of a fusion-based economy is going to be, what the value of, how you're going to value a steel mill before an economic revolution and after an economic revolution. Or as LaRouche used to put it, when in primitive man, when he was trying to till his field, and he unfortunately stuck his stick into the ground when he's trying to plant seeds, and up came ugly black crude, that wasn't a good thing. It had no value. You know, oil does not have value until you have the human culture that's invented some way to relook at what's called natural resource, you know. So it's the things are going to get revalued in a scientific revolution. And the question was, how do you look at the parameters and the causal relations before the revolution and try to make an intelligent investment in terms of bringing online something that does not exist yet? You can't just say, I love fusion energy. It's the way of the future. It's my gimmick. Give me all the money in the world. We're going to have it. You have to responsibly say, we've got to keep the engine of society running in this pre-revolutionary mode, pre-scientific revolution mode, and figure out how much we want to have. About 10 or 15 different paths to pursue to try to develop different aspects of fusion processes and plasma physics processes. Some of them are going to pay off and some of them are not going to pay off. And that's how the Apollo program was run. If you looked at the funding of the Apollo program, a lot of parts of it didn't pay off directly. But, you know, we developed a whole new industrial processing modes based upon that. So this trick of trying to develop the culture to have the human minds have more control and more confidence in being willing to develop more complicated ways of thinking about ideas is the only thing that has value. I mean, you go back and read the Federalist Papers of Alexander Hamilton and friends of what they thought Americans should be thinking about in 1787 and 1788, when they were being told we can't just have a confederation, we have to have a constitution which has the rights of a federal government to print out money. You know, are we going back to a king and queen system? Are they going to take all our powers away from us? You know, you read those papers and it asks upon, it's not dumbed down. It asks people to actually have a concentration span and think through these things about how a federal government's going to work and what powers the state will have. And most people today can't read these things. They've been dumbed down by rock music, by the culture. They just like to have their feelings stroked. And so LaRouche had to answer the question when he was doing this work on the LaRouche-Riemann economic model to try to figure out how to evaluate, how to put a value on why you'd have what turned out to be 10 to 30 year projects, which weren't 50 or 100-year projects, and they weren't 3-year projects. How the possible delineation of the shape of a new scientific world, new fusion and plasma physics based world, how that could give you, how you could start getting a metric out of that topological relationship. I mean, let me demystify a couple of things. People think they understand about gravity, and when they're a kid, they find out that people in Australia are standing upside down. and they think people in Australia are weird people.
Well, how
They're
do
going
they
to fall
do
off
that?
the earth.
How do they do
I
that,
thought that.
David?
Yeah, everybody thinks that. And they get told these different versions of stories about gravity. And sooner or later they figure out, well, okay, I'll buy into that. And they think they know what they're talking about. Most people today, they don't really know what gravity is. They'd be much better shape if they went back and revisited those childhood thoughts. Or why does a mass draw another mass to, the explanation somehow is the Earth is a big mass and we're little bitty things, and we get drawn, we get sucked into it. And if we are near this, and the solar system works the same way, the sun is a much, much bigger mass, and it sucks us in. And we don't ask questions. Well, why do masses? What do they have to do with some force? Einstein asked these questions about mass and force and fusion. That equation he had: energy equals mass times a really big number, the speed of light squared. Why would that be the case? Some energetic, something about magical about this really wonderful thing called light, which is we haven't figured out all how that thing works, but somehow a little bit of mass can be transformed into a heck of a lot more energy than that by trying burning it or by relying upon some chemical attributes of the mass. Somehow there's something hidden in it that has excuse my language, a hell of a lot more to it than that. And so people need to have fun rethinking these simple mysteries of life, like people in Australia stand upside down, and stop get a little bit angry that the teacher sold you something. Maybe the teacher did the best they could at the time, but they really LaRouche used to get very angry about these type of being told these insipid narratives when he was growing up, and he would just ask. He was the kid that asked the questions why. And when he was doing all this work on the LaRouche-Riemann model, he just said, "Look, I would concentrate for hours at a time to try to develop this stuff, and it was fatiguing. But I found that the only recreation I had when I walked away from the work I had to listen to late Beethoven quartets. He had to listen to something where the shapes of ideas were being lawfully developed in a mature way, where Beethoven was speaking to him and saying, I know how the ideas of the human mind work, what they're capable of. And I know, Lynn, 130 years later, you also are fighting with this sort of thing. And it became very important to look for cultural celebrations, real lawful developments of ideas to give our poor population confidence that their minds are worth developing and they're not just little black holes where you just sit there privately thinking, well, freedom is I get to run around anything I want in my head. I have a lot of dirty thoughts about people, or sometimes I have a few nice thoughts about people, and but most of those thoughts, the oligarchy, the empires, they figured out how to manipulate those things a long time ago. And we're not going to free ourselves and be a sovereign country without raising the cultural and the skill level. And that's why, Lynn knew a little bit about Friedrich Schiller also, but it was really his wife, Helga, who pounded on him on Friedrich Schiller, the poet of the American Revolution, somebody who would do with language something similar to what Beethoven was doing with music.
And
did I make it worse or did I make it better there?
Oh, well, I've been holding on to this question. I almost forgot to ask it, but you reminded me, so here it comes. In the violin, in the violin concerto, you indicated that Beethoven would put things in that might help people learn how to think. Well, I've been thinking about this for decades. The little theme I don't know. I don't read it. I've never seen it on paper, so I don't know the answer to this. Is it dun 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 dun? Right, that's the theme, right?
The last movement, yes.
Okay, so my question is the downbeat the first note, or is the downbeat the third note? So that da
You
da
sung it correctly.
dun da
Up,
dun
the
da
first
da
note has
dun.
to be the pickup.
Why
Oh, I see what you're saying.
couldn't it be da 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 da, or is it dun da dun da da dun da dun da da? It
Well,
seems
you
like
got a little jazz background going on there.
he's written it in a way that's going to make me crazy because it keeps going back and forth to me. It's like looking at one of those pictures that sometimes the skirt is green and sometimes it's gold.
Uh-huh.
It's like which one do you hear it? Is it which one is the downbeat?
Well, I mean, the good thing, the rich thing about these things is there are a lot of cross currents.
Yeah,
On the first level, certainly the second note is the downbeat. Bum, 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 bum. It's in 6/8, 6/8 notes. The
yeah.
8 is the eighth note, gives you the meter,
So
and
the
there's
first
six of
one
them.
to pick up then.
No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2. So 6,
Yeah.
1, 3, 4, 6, 1, 3, 4.
Do some people do they play it to make it sound ambiguous? Like you don't really know, because that's what I think's going on. Is people are like playing it in a way to make me crazy.
It's well, you're probably right. I mean, there are illiterate versions who a non-crazy version has got they can play upon different cross currents. There are different ways to perform these things, just
Yeah.
like there are different ways to give a speech and connect up ideas. But
Mm.
uh, uh, Lynn used to have a very famous thing back in the 70s to challenge people. He said, there's only one thing wrong with the Communist Party USA. They're no damn good. But you have to pause for about, 3 or 4 or 5 seconds in between. Let
Yeah.
people try to figure out, what do you mean only one thing wrong? And most jokes work on some basis of that. And the
Mhm.
different types of I can't tell you the final answer to your question on the Beethoven violin concerto. The last movement is certainly it's got a Scottish lilt to it, and it's certainly more celebratory in a certain sense, more friendly to the listener. The opening, I thought you were going to hit me with the opening. That beautiful melody.
Oh, I have
That thing is you can
no
fall in love with
I
immediately.
have no questions about that at all. I just want to sit back and listen to it. That
But
is
then my question then is, do you remember the first measure of the piece?
no, I don't know it that well.
It's totally wild.
Yeah.
It's just the timpani going boom, 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 just hitting 4 quarter notes.
Okay.
Boom, boom. You think what could possibly come from that? And it's a real challenge. I'm not gonna try to expound on it now. I've never solved this thing and I've known this piece for a long time. But why he would start that with just that little heartbeat at the beginning? Boom, 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 boom. Because I'm convinced he, in his mind, knows and is committed to expounding on the richness that leads to that, and the second moment is just even. So I mean, what I can before Beethoven, I may have to say this: before Mozart and Beethoven, there was classical music, and there was classical poems. A classical poem typically has 4 lines. It has a first line that states something. It has a second line that's some sort of contrast to it. I'm talking very generally. It has a third line which somehow addresses the difference of the first 2 lines and poses, as it were, the paradox. And it has a fourth line which somehow resolves things. Now, not all poems do that, but there's a reason why there's 4 lines in a stanza, and there's a reason why there's a classical form to these things. What happened with, and so in music, you had something stated by way of a theme, something contrast to it, like pasta and antipasta. You had some contrast to it too. And there, in better compositions, there was some relationship between the A theme and the B theme. And sometimes it was an inversion of one. It wasn't as closely connected as what I went through in the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. The revolutionary thing about Beethoven, it was called motivführung, where you have one idea powerful enough to lead the whole composition. You didn't have simply an A section and a B section, and by the end of the movement, you find out you got a clue as to how they were related to each other. They're really kissing cousins, of each other. They had more to them, and the richness of the first theme could be developed. The development section, because you had something mysterious about the second theme, which it's like in a play. You had some second character come in who knew something about the first character, and the audience got interested in how this whole thing was going to work out. That was a classical sonata form. What Beethoven did beyond the classical sonata form of A-B-A was this Mozart-Führung, this revolutionary development that Mozart introduced in 1781, 1782. We don't have time to go into all that, but it was a more powerful type of theme where everything in the movement was connected with the shape of that one idea. And for example, in the third movement of the Fifth Symphony, you have a theme, a powerful, gripping theme, which is 16 notes, and the first 12 notes are the same note. Can you imagine a gripping theme that the first 12 notes of it is the same note?
Mm-hmm.
I'll do it for you now. It comes in the brass. They go bum 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 ba da da da.
Yeah.
And it's gripping. And you describe it as 16 notes of the first 12 being the same note, but that's that 3-to-1 relationship. Short, long. But now they're 3 in a row of them. Now you have, as you were talking earlier about augmentation, and the fourth one, which is not really longer than the other 3, it's not really short, long, but it's now lyrical. And so that shape of the ideas gripped everything. Everything in the symphony is based upon that powerful idea, which even precedes a melody. Is not a melody. They call it a motif. Anyhow, there's powerful things that go on in the human mind, which we should be more honest about. We'd be a lot happier. And when poets appeal to something which is a puzzle to be solved, as you sort of characterized things earlier, the poet relies upon the fact that he doesn't want to beat his audience over the head with boring lectures that say, this is the truth, let me tell you the truth. It doesn't work that way. They've got to get under the audience's skin by suggesting a puzzle that's interesting enough for the audience to start engaging their own faculties and becoming better people. And as Friedrich Schiller put it, a play is supposed to leave an audience, the essay I think is called something about the moral, I'm forgetting the name of the essay, but that the play will make people better people than what they were when they entered it. And you don't do it by a morality play and saying the bad guy went to hell, you should be a good person. You do it by engaging the population in something gripping. So anyhow, that's was classical culture. Classical culture is not old fogey stuff. One last thing, I think I said it in the first show. Classical culture depends upon, like the golden mean or the spiral shape of galaxies, is that man is really made in the image of his creator. And it would be an awful world if God has simply made a bunch of perfect little automatons who could live forever and never die. People think that's the way it should be. But the Greek gods before the Christian God, they were just, they had no mission in life. They would do the same thing every morning. And it usually led up to hijinks and sex and tricks, and it was awful. And in fact, we have a mission in life. We were made in the image of God. We're not God. But this is the idea of the self-similar spiral. It works out in mathematics. It works out in a theme, an opening theme. And classical music means that the opening idea is already in the small, represents how the whole thing's going to work. But it's going to take some time to develop the idea. But it's not, if it was a speech, it'd be like the guy opening up the speech says something bold, but he doesn't waste your time. Everything he says in the rest of the speech, actually, by the time you get to the restatement at the very end, made not only the opening wild idea make sense, but it made the person can now reflect upon why he's a different person. because there's something didn't make sense to him at the beginning. Now, having solved that puzzle, his mind is now more powerful.
Thank you so much, David Shavin. We are going to benefit a lot from from your show tomorrow. The Schiller Institute .com is where to find it. It starts at 9 o'clock, I think, Eastern time. If not that, 10 o'clock, but you can visit schillerinstitute.com to get the details. Yeah, 9
There's the
o'clock.
announcement. There you go.
Thanks, Andy. Um, yeah, David, you've really given me a lot of hope that we can somehow come out of this crisis we're in right now by broadening our minds and increasing the ability of people to realize that humanity is more than just earning a living and more than just obeying what you're told, but that we have to not only for ourselves but for our future develop a real renaissance of thinking, of creativity, of thinking outside the box and creating new ways to supply our needs without destroying the planet as we do so. And we've got to get back to a basic faith that yeah, we are created in the image of God. If so many of our leaders and the people that run our systems, like the banks, for instance, seem to have lost that whole idea that we're not just here to breathe in and out and enjoy food, sex, and a good night's sleep now and then. That we're here to express something immortal, something important. And that's what, when we talk about trying to express immortality, that's when Beethoven comes into my mind. And I think of the shadow that he's cast, which will last for thousands of years. I do believe that. And I do believe that, we have to keep on doing what you do, and that is to educate people as to our music and the importance of quality, of just there's nothing wrong with quality. Quality is good stuff, and it's addictive. You get hooked on it, and kids don't need to be very old before you start with it. It's been a great pleasure tonight, David, as always, and we hope that you'll be able to come back and spend some more time with us, bringing us up to date with what you've been doing and your thoughts about the future and how we can expand the understanding of culture, music, and reason as part of life in this country and in the world.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you very
again.
much. I think you do have a very rare show, and I hope it gets less rare and we have a lot more people pick up on what you're doing. And there's reasons for hope. We're living in a country that did something really quite unique, and it'd be a shame if we don't challenge ourselves to figure out how the country did what we did. I think there's a little bit of what we've been talking about in that has been shown in some of the best times of our history. That's what Lincoln referred to as the bringing the better angel of our natures out. And I think people, or the World War II generation, or there's a lot of examples. It's just in recent times we've lost ourselves, and it doesn't have to go down that way.
All right. Thanks again, David. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you.